The Rise of Rome, from the Seven Hills to the Republic. The story of Rome begins on the Apennine Peninsula. Human footprints here date back to the Paleolithic age, but millennia of migration eventually turned the land into a crowded, volatile frontier. By the 8th century BC, ancient natives like the Ligurians and Sardinians were forced to share the peninsula with waves of newcomers. Indo-European tribes like the Umbrians, Sabines, and Latins pushed in. Etruscans arrived from Asia Minor, Greek colonists claimed the coast, and Gauls spilled over the Alps. The ancestors of Rome were just one minor offshoot of the Latin tribes, a small player on a very crowded stage. To understand how they eventually rose to dominate the others, we have to look at the foundation of the city itself. In the 9th and 8th centuries BC, migrating tribes settled across 7 hills, including the Palatine, Esquiline, and Quirinal, forming isolated villages. These settlements gradually merged into the League of the Seven Hills, with the Latins on the Palatine Hill serving as its core. This was the earliest iteration of the Roman kingdom. But the Romans tell a much darker foundation myth. Numitor and Amulius were descendants of the Trojan prince Aeneas. Numitor was the rightful king of Alba Longa, while his brother Amulius controlled the treasury. Amulius, however, craved the throne and eventually overthrew his brother. To ensure Numitor's bloodline could never rise up to seek revenge, Amulius forced his brother's only daughter, Rhea Silvia, to become a Vestal virgin, a priestess strictly forbidden from marrying. According to legend, she was seduced by Mars, the god of war, and gave birth to twin boys, Romulus and Remus. When Amulius found out, he ordered Rhea Silvia buried alive and had the infants dumped in the wilderness to die. They survived only because a she-wolf found them, nursing the boys until a shepherd named Faustulus took them in. When the twins grew up, they returned to overthrow Amulius and restore their grandfather to the throne. Afterward, a restless faction of the city, refugees, drifters, and slaves, almost entirely male, followed the brothers into the wilderness to build something new. But the brothers violently clashed over where to build it. The dispute escalated, and Romulus murdered Remus. He named the new settlement after himself, Rome. The year was 753 BC, and Romulus crowned himself the first king, ushering in the Roman monarchy. This early Rome faced an immediate crisis, a severe shortage of women. Without a next generation, the city would die with its founders. Led by Romulus, the Roman men decided to secure their future by raiding the neighboring Sabine tribes. They engineered a grand festival, inviting the Sabines to bring their entire families. But as the guests sat down to feast, the Romans struck. In the chaos, they abducted over 700 Sabine women and forced them into marriage. The Sabines naturally fought back, sparking a grinding series of wars that bled both sides. Just as the armies arrayed for another slaughter, the abducted women intervened. They rushed onto the battlefield, physically standing between the weapons of their fathers and their new husbands. By this point, the women had borne children. The two warring tribes were already bound by blood. Realizing that further fighting would only destroy their own families, the leaders on both sides laid down their arms. The Romans and the Sabines merged, living together as a single society. In its early days, Roman society was a strict clan system bound by bloodlines, built on 3 main tribes, the Latins, the Sabines, and the Etruscans. Each tribe was divided into 10 curiae, and each curia contained 10 clans. The noble heads of these clans gathered to discuss state affairs, forming an advisory council that would eventually become the Roman Senate. Under this tribal framework, power was divided 3 ways. The king, or rex, commanded the army, the courts, and religious rites, holding a position determined by election. The curiate assembly, made up of all adult males from the clans, had the final say on declaring war, electing kings, and handing down death sentences. Meanwhile, the Senate reviewed these major issues before they reached the Assembly, allowing the elite nobles to steer state policy from behind the scenes. Rome's monarchical era saw 7 kings in total. Under the first 5, the city expanded rapidly, absorbing surrounding tribes and swelling its population. But this massive influx of outsiders collided directly with the entrenched privileges of the original clans. The primitive tribal government simply could not manage a sprawling urban society. To fix this, the 6th king, Servius Tullius, engineered a radical political restructuring. Servius instituted a sweeping census. He dismantled the old political boundaries of blood and lineage, replacing them with a system based entirely on personal wealth. The wealthiest class was now required to fund and equip 80 centuries of heavy infantry and 18 centuries of cavalry. The lowest class, lacking property, only had to form a single century of light infantry. He then reorganized the government around this military framework, creating the Centuriate Assembly. This new body stripped the old Curiate Assembly of its core duties, taking over the power to declare war, elect officials, and judge capital cases. The critical shift was in the voting. In the new assembly, each century held exactly 1 vote. The wealthiest class controlled 98 centuries, giving them 98 votes. The other 5 classes combined held only 95. Rome was no longer ruled by ancient bloodlines. It was now an oligarchy of wealth. Men without property lost their political voice entirely. By replacing a tribal society with a class system defined by property, Servius transformed Rome from a primitive clan network into a functioning state. In 535 BC, Tarquin the Proud seized the throne. History records that he orchestrated the assassination of Servius to take power. His reign was defined by paranoia and brutal autocracy, pushing Roman resentment to a breaking point. In 510 BC, while King Tarquin was away on a military campaign, he sent his son, Sextus Tarquinius, to the town of Calatia. There, Sextus was hosted by a royal relative named Collatinus, whose wife, Lucretia, was widely respected for her loyalty and virtue. One evening, the men were drinking in the military camp. The conversation devolved into a crude argument, with each man boasting about the virtue of his own wife. To settle the dispute, Collatinus proposed they ride back to their homes unannounced in the dead of night to see exactly what their wives were doing while the men were at war. The inspection proved Collatinus right. While the other wives were found drinking and socializing, Lucretia was alone in the deep of night, working at her loom. Collatinus won the wager and returned to camp satisfied. But for Sextus, the wager had sparked a dark obsession. Under the cover of darkness, he slipped away from the camp, returned to Calatia, and infiltrated her bedroom. Lucretia woke to find Sextus standing over her with a drawn blade. He offered a brutal ultimatum: submit to him and become queen when he took the throne, or resist, in which case he would murder her on the spot, slaughter a slave, and leave their bodies together to convince the world he had executed them for adultery. The next morning, dressed in black mourning clothes, Lucretia summoned her father and her husband. Kneeling before them, she coldly recounted the violence and humiliation of the previous night. She demanded they swear an oath to avenge her, warning them that even though her attacker was a prince, this crime could not be buried. The men were paralyzed by shock and rage, hesitating over the political weight of striking at the royal family. Lucretia did not wait for them to decide. Unable to live with the violation of her honor, she drew a concealed dagger and drove it into her own heart. As Collatinus broke down over his wife's body, his closest friend, Brutus, stepped forward. Pulling the blood-soaked blade from Lucretia's chest, Brutus raised the dagger and swore an oath to the gods that the tyrant would be eradicated. Brutus carried Lucretia's body to the public forum in Rome, exposing the royal family's atrocity to the masses. His speech instantly ignited decades of suppressed rage, turning the shock of the crowd into a violent uprising against the crown. The Roman people mobilized, they formed an army, and in 509 BC they overthrew Tarquin the Proud, permanently exiling his bloodline from the city. In the aftermath of the revolution, the Romans designed a radically new political architecture, the Republic. The people elected Brutus and Collatinus as the first consuls of Rome. After 240 years of rule, the era of kings was dead and the Roman Republic was born. From foundation to the Gallic invasion. In 509 BC, led by Brutus and Collatinus, the Romans overthrew their monarchy. This marked the birth of the Roman Republic, an era that would last nearly 5 centuries until 27 BC. The history of this republic is driven by 2 parallel forces, a relentless internal class struggle between commoners and nobles that forged Roman law, and a massive outward expansion that ultimately secured their dominance over the Mediterranean. With the kings gone, the Senate elected 2 consuls from the nobility to govern the state and check each other's power. In times of extreme crisis like total war, the Senate could appoint a single dictator to assume absolute control. Over time, the Romans built out the rest of their political machinery, adding tribunes and aediles to manage a rapidly evolving nation. At its birth, however, the Republic was far from a superpower. It was a minor state on the Apennine Peninsula, completely surrounded by hostile neighbors. To the north were the Etruscans, Italy's dominant power. To the south were the Volsci, the Samnites, and Greek colonists. For its first 100 years, the Republic existed in a state of perpetual warfare just to survive. By the late 5th century BC, Rome began gaining ground against the Volsci. At the same time, they locked into a bitter conflict with the Etruscans. 12 miles northeast of Rome stood Veii, a heavily fortified Etruscan stronghold. These 2 cities had been bleeding each other since the era of kings, fighting over water, land, salt, and slaves. Rome suffered a severe defeat at Veii in 476 BC, clawed back a victory in 430, and marched again in 405 with the intent of total annexation. What followed was a grueling decade-long siege that drained both sides. Finally, in 396 BC, the Roman consul Camillus shattered the deadlock and breached the city. After 3 Veientine Wars, Rome permanently eliminated its Etruscan rival and expanded its reach into northern Italy. This victory fundamentally changed how Rome operated. Instead of just raiding, they began building colonies in conquered territories, forcing treaties, and installing Roman officials to govern, weaving a complex web of autonomous regions and forced alliances. But conquering the north meant inheriting its vulnerabilities. Rome was now directly exposed to the chaotic frontier beyond the Apennines. Just 5 years later, in 391 BC, a massive tribal coalition of Gauls led by a warlord named Brennus swept down the Adriatic coast from northern Italy. They crushed everything in their path, eventually besieging the Etruscan city of Clusium. Desperate, Clusium begged Rome for military aid. Rome sent envoys to negotiate a peace, but diplomacy collapsed into violence, and during the chaos, a Roman ambassador killed a Gallic chieftain. To the Gauls, this was an unforgivable violation of diplomatic law. Enraged, they abandoned the siege of Clusium, assembled their horde, and marched directly on Rome. In 390 BC, the 2 armies collided at the Allia River, just 10 miles north of the capital. The exact troop numbers have been lost to history. Estimates range wildly, putting the Romans anywhere from 15,000 to 40,000 men, and the Gauls between 12,000 and 70,000. Modern historians generally lean toward the lower estimates, but the tactical reality of the battle is undisputed. The sheer speed of the Gallic advance caught the Romans completely off guard. The Roman legions had no time to build a fortified camp. To avoid being outflanked, the Roman commander stretched his lines dangerously thin, positioning a reserve force on a small hill to secure the right flank. Brennus anticipated this, fearing that the Roman right wing would strike his rear once the main lines engaged. The Gallic warlord bypassed the center and drove his forces directly into the Roman right flank. This flanking assault instantly shattered the Roman formation. The left wing frantically tried to collapse inward to reinforce the right, but the Gauls had already carved through the lines, cutting off their retreat. In brutal close-quarters combat, the heavier Gallic longswords butchered the Roman infantry. The line broke. Total panic swept through the legions. The survivors of the left wing fled to the ruins of Veii, while the remnants of the right wing sprinted blindly back to Rome. The slaughter was so sudden that the Gauls themselves stopped in their tracks, suspicious of a trap, before finally looting the dead and resuming their march on the capital. By the time the Gauls arrived, most of the surviving Roman army was hiding in Veii. Only a fraction of the military had made it back to Rome. The defenders knew they lacked the manpower to hold the city walls. To preserve the survival of the state, every able-bodied man and the remaining supplies were moved to the Capitoline Hill, a steep, heavily fortified citadel. Everyone else, the elderly, the women, and the children, was left behind in the undefended city below. When the Gauls reached the gates of Rome, they found them wide open and unguarded. Suspecting a massive ambush, they cautiously made camp between the city and the Anio River. The next morning, after leaving a rear guard at the gates, the main horde poured into Rome. They found empty streets, scattered barricades, and the doors of the patrician estates left wide open. The city was dead silent. But in the courtyards, the Gauls discovered the elderly senators of Rome. Dressed in their finest ceremonial robes, these old men sat motionless on their porches, silently waiting for death. A Gallic soldier approached one of the senators and curiously stroked the old man's long beard. Insulted by the touch, the senator raised his ivory walking stick and struck the soldier across the head. The enraged Gaul instantly drew his sword and cut the old man down. That single strike triggered a massacre. Every senator remaining in the city was slaughtered. To force the defenders off the Capitoline Hill, the Gauls looted Rome and set the city on fire. For days, the capital burned until it was nothing but ash and rubble. But the Roman garrison refused to surrender. Realizing the fires wouldn't break them, the Gauls launched a direct frontal assault up the hill. The Romans held the high ground. Exhausted but anchored to the cliffs, the defenders repelled wave after wave of Gallic infantry. Bleeding from the failed assaults, the Gauls changed tactics. They surrounded the base of the hill to starve the Romans out. This strategy, however, triggered a massive logistical nightmare for the besiegers. The Romans had already stripped the surrounding countryside of food, forcing the Gauls to scatter their forces miles away just to forage. Meanwhile, the shattered Roman army hiding in Veii began to regroup. They armed the city's slaves, secured reinforcements from their Latin allies, and recalled Camillus, the exiled former consul who had conquered Veii years before. Granted emergency command, Camillus rapidly rebuilt the legions and marched toward Rome. Back at the Capitoline Hill, the besieging Gauls had discovered a hidden, steep path leading to the summit. On a pitch-black night, a Gallic strike team scaled the cliffs in total silence. They moved so quietly that neither the Roman sentries nor the guard dogs detected them. But just as the first assassins pulled themselves over the ramparts, they disturbed a flock of sacred geese kept in the temple of Juno. The birds erupted in alarm. The noise jolted the Roman garrison awake. The defenders rushed to the cliff edge, engaged the infiltrators in brutal hand-to-hand combat, and hurled the Gallic vanguard back down the mountain. After the failed night raid, the siege devolved into a grueling war of attrition. The Romans on the hill were starving to death, but the Gauls below were faring even worse. Malaria swept through the Gallic camps, killing soldiers by the hundreds. Unable to sustain the siege, the Gauls finally offered terms. They would lift the blockade and leave Roman territory for a heavy ransom. Initially, the Roman commanders refused, knowing that Camillus and his relief army were on the way. But the starvation had broken the garrison's morale. Begged by their own dying men, the leadership folded. To preserve the lives of the survivors, Rome agreed to pay 1,000 pounds of gold. When the time came to weigh the ransom, the Romans realized the Gauls were using rigged scales to extort even more wealth. When a Roman official furiously protested the cheating, Brennus, the Gallic warlord, drew his heavy sword and threw it directly onto the weights. He looked at the Romans and sneered, "This is the sorrow of the vanquished." With no army left to fight, the Romans swallowed the humiliation and scrambled to strip the city of whatever gold remained to make up the difference. But before the transaction could be finished, Camillus and his relief army marched through the ruins. Camillus ordered the Gauls to step away from the gold. The Gauls protested, arguing that a legal treaty had already been struck. Camillus coldly rejected it, stating that no agreement was valid without the explicit authorization of the Roman Senate. The negotiations instantly collapsed, swords were drawn, and the two armies clashed right there in the ashes of Rome. Under the command of Camillus, the revitalized Roman legions utterly destroyed the Gallic horde, wiping away the humiliation of the ransom. This dramatic arc of destruction and vengeance comes to us primarily from the ancient Roman historian Livy. While modern historians debate whether the Gauls were actually defeated in battle or simply took the gold and walked away, Livy's version of Rome's darkest hour and its violent resurrection became the definitive legend of the Republic. The crisis within, class struggle, and the evolution of the Republic. By crushing the Etruscans in the Veientine Wars, Rome took its first definitive step toward empire, but the triumph was short-lived. The Gallic invasion and the burning of Rome left a deep, lingering psychological scar on the population. Sensing Roman vulnerability, the surrounding tribes pounced. Former subjects like the Volsci, the Aequi, and fractured Etruscan cities instantly revolted, while old friends, the Latin League and the Hernisi, tore up their treaties. Rome was given no time to heal. It took 40 years of relentless, grinding warfare for the Romans to crush these rebellions and finally secure total dominance over the central Apennines. Yet, while Rome fought for its life on the frontiers, a vicious class war threatened to tear the state apart from the inside. The early republic was essentially an aristocracy. Political power belonged exclusively to the patricians, elite families who traced their noble bloodlines back to the founding of the city. Opposite them stood the plebeians, a massive lower class of commoners, immigrants, and conquered outsiders. The patricians maintained a total monopoly on government offices, religious priesthoods, and the Senate. A tight circle of dynasties, like the Fabii, the Claudii, and the Cornelii, essentially rotated absolute power among themselves. The wealth-based reforms of King Servius Tullius had shifted the military burden, but kept the political gates firmly locked. The wealthier plebeians had money, but no voice. As Rome expanded, the patricians used their legal privileges to swallow up the newly conquered land, leaving the poorer commoners with nothing. Constant military drafts bled the small farms dry. When crop failures forced these farmers into debt, they were stripped of their rights and dragged into debt slavery, entirely at the mercy of their patrician creditors. In 494 BC, that pressure finally boiled over. Rome desperately needed soldiers for a foreign campaign, but the exhausted, indebted farmers simply refused the draft. Panicked, the consuls released indebted plebeians from prison, promising total debt forgiveness if they marched to the front lines. The men agreed, fought, and won, but when they returned to Rome victorious, the consuls broke their word. The veterans were met not with honor but with shackles, thrown right back into prison. The plebeians did not riot. They simply walked out. In a highly organized collective strike, they abandoned Rome entirely, marching to the nearby Sacred Mount, threatening to build a new city and leave the patricians to rot. For a nation constantly at war, losing its entire working class and its infantry was a death sentence. The patricians had no choice. They folded and accepted the plebeian demands. This walkout forced the creation of a powerful new office, the tribune of the plebs. Acting as the official representatives of the commoners, tribunes wielded the absolute power to veto any legislation that harmed the lower class. Furthermore, their physical bodies were declared sacrosanct, meaning anyone who harmed a tribune would be legally condemned to death. By 471 BC, the plebeians secured the right to elect these tribunes in their own independent assembly, locking the patricians out of the voting process. But the struggle was far from over. This strategy of mass secession would be weaponized 4 more times in Roman history. Like many early civilizations, Rome had no written laws. Patrician judges relied entirely on oral tradition, allowing them to effortlessly twist the rules to crush commoners in court. In 462 BC, a tribune demanded a written legal code. After a decade of bitter political gridlock, a commission of 10 patricians was formed in 451 BC to draft the text. They failed to finish the job. The next year, a new commission, split evenly between patricians and plebeians, finally completed it. The result was the Law of the 12 Tables. Etched in bronze, this code governed everything from debt and property to marriage, inheritance, and religion. It still heavily protected patrician interests, but it destroyed their monopoly on legal interpretation. The rules of the game were finally visible, preventing the elites from arbitrarily changing the law to suit their needs. This was a massive historical victory for the common class. The 12 Tables became the permanent bedrock of Roman jurisprudence, influencing legal language for centuries to come. Slowly, the patrician grip on the government loosened. Between 444 and 367 BC, the state rarely elected consuls. Instead, power was frequently delegated to military tribunes, a high-ranking position that plebeians were legally permitted to hold. Soon after, financial offices were also opened to the lower class. But progress stalled when the Gauls burned Rome. The sack triggered a massive economic collapse. Farms were scorched, driving countless smallholders into bankruptcy and tenancy. To recoup their own financial losses, the patricians ruthlessly squeezed the lower classes. Land, debt, and political equality instantly became explosive issues all over again. In response, the plebeians forced through a devastating sequence of legislative strikes. In 367 BC, the Licinio-Sextian laws slashed debt interest and legally allowed a plebeian to be elected consul. In 342 BC, new legislation dictated that both consuls could be plebeians. In 326 BC, the Poetelian law officially abolished the brutal practice of debt slavery. And in 300 BC, the Ogulnian law opened the elite religious priesthoods to the common class. The final blow came in 287 BC following the fifth and final plebeian walkout. The Hortensian law dictated a radical new reality. Any resolution passed by the plebeian assembly was now legally binding on all Roman citizens, including the patricians, without requiring any approval from the Senate. This singular event marked the absolute end of a class struggle that had lasted for over 2 centuries. Compare the Rome of 494 BC to the Rome of 287 BC. It evolved from a fractured, unstable city on the brink of collapse into a highly cohesive state. Over time, the old aristocrats and the wealthy plebeians merged to form a new ruling nobility. At the same time, the economic reality for the lower classes drastically improved. With land distributed more fairly, small farmers could actually survive. This created a massive, fiercely loyal pool of manpower for the Roman legions. To manage this growing complexity, the state developed highly specialized bureaucratic offices. The survival of the Republic ultimately came down to a raw political pragmatism. Rome possessed a working class rational enough to negotiate and an elite class pragmatic enough to yield. Through calculated compromise, the Romans dismantled an oppressive social hierarchy without shedding their own blood. The city was no longer divided against itself. When the Roman legions marched out of the gates, the plebeian infantry holding the shields and the patrician commanders giving the orders were finally fighting for the exact same republic. The internal wars were over. The conquest of the Mediterranean had begun. The expansion of Rome, the Samnite Wars, and the campaigns of Pyrrhus. After surviving the Gallic sack, Rome spent 4 grueling decades crushing the rebellions of its former subjects and settling its internal scores with the Latin League. With the center of the peninsula finally secured, the Romans looked south. By 343 BC, Roman influence pushed against the borders of Campania, meeting another rising power at the exact same frontier, the Samnites. Initially, the two nations maintained a fragile friendship, but the peace was quickly broken. To secure a critical trade route, the Samnites launched a massive offensive against Tinum, the capital of the Sidicini tribe. Desperate, the Sidicini begged their neighbor Campania for military aid. The Campanians answered the call, but instead of breaking the siege, their army was slaughtered by the Samnites. Facing total destruction, the Campanians turned to Rome. They sent envoys offering to surrender their cities, their land, and their independence just to become a Roman vassal and survive. This surrender shattered the peace between Rome and the Samnites. In 343 BC, Rome declared war. The First Samnite War began in Rome's favor. Across the sea, the Empire of Carthage even sent a golden crown to Rome to congratulate them on their early victories. But in the second year of the campaign, the Roman garrison stationed at Capua mutinied. This internal collapse stalled the offensive, locking the war into a stalemate. The Samnites, meanwhile, had no desire to bleed themselves dry over a single patch of territory. Because of this, in 341 BC, both sides recalled their old diplomatic ties and negotiated a ceasefire. The treaty lasted 14 years in name only. It was a Cold War, defined by proxy conflicts over land and vassal states. The tension finally snapped in 326 BC when the city of Naples, a Samnite stronghold, rebelled and defected to Rome. To secure absolute control over the southern half of the peninsula, the Second Samnite War was launched. Rome took the early initiative, but in 321 BC, the Samnites executed a devastating tactical trap. They lured 50,000 Roman soldiers into a narrow mountain pass known as the Caudine Forks, completely sealing them inside. The Samnite leadership was fiercely divided on what to do with the trapped legions. Sparing the soldiers might forge a lasting peace, while slaughtering them would permanently cripple Roman military power. Ultimately, the Samnites chose to humiliate them. They forced the starving Roman legions to drop their weapons, strip off their armor, and march out of the gorge under a yoke of crossed spears, treating the citizens of Rome like subjugated cattle. When the news reached Rome, the Senate was paralyzed by the disgrace. But the disaster forced Rome to completely rebuild its military. They overhauled their tactics, upgraded their weaponry, and aggressively expanded their manpower. By 312 BC, to guarantee military logistics, the Roman official Appius Claudius commissioned a massive paved highway straight to the front lines, the Appian Way. Diplomatically, Rome surrounded the Samnites by forging alliances with their neighbors, isolating them entirely. Exhausted by the grinding conflict, both sides agreed to another ceasefire in 304 BC. During the peace, Rome tightened its grip on territories like Campania and Apulia. The Samnites attempted to build an alliance with the Lucanians, but were rejected. When the Samnites resorted to military threats, the outgunned Lucanians immediately appealed to Rome for protection. Because of this, the Third Samnite War erupted in 298 BC. This time, the Samnites assembled a massive, desperate coalition, uniting Etruscans, Gauls, and Umbrians to crush Rome once and for all. Early in the conflict, Rome walked into an ambush and suffered a brutal defeat. Facing an existential threat, the Roman state resorted to extreme measures. They drafted retired veterans and even armed their own slaves to rebuild the legions. This desperate new force rushed to the front and utterly destroyed the coalition, forcing the Samnites into a final surrender and stripping them of their territory. After 3 grueling wars, Rome firmly secured its grip over central Italy. With the Samnites broken, Rome targeted the wealthy Greek city-states in the south. In 282 BC, a Roman naval squadron violated a non-aggression pact and sailed directly into the harbor of Tarentum. The local garrison opened fire. When diplomatic envoys failed to resolve the clash, the two states went to war. Tarentum was merely a colonial outpost. It had no chance of surviving a Roman invasion alone. Desperate, the city sent a plea across the Adriatic to Pyrrhus, the king of Epirus. Pyrrhus was fiercely ambitious, desperate to forge a legacy like Alexander the Great. Seeing a perfect excuse to carve out an empire in Italy, he accepted the call. In 280 BC, Pyrrhus landed in Italy with 25,000 elite soldiers and 20 war elephants. The two armies met near Heraclea. Pyrrhus commanded 30,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, 500 slingers, and his elephant corps. The Romans, led by the consul Laevinus, deployed 40,000 infantry and over 2,000 cavalry. Pyrrhus positioned his forces on the left bank of the Ceres River, waiting for the Romans to cross. Before dawn, the Roman vanguard waded through the water and launched a surprise attack on the Greek scouts. Once word reached Pyrrhus, he deployed his cavalry to buy time while his main infantry advanced to the riverbank. After a wave of suppressing fire from Greek archers and slingers, the two armies collided. It was a brutal, grinding clash between the Roman legion and the Macedonian-style phalanx. The armies charged each other 7 times, and 7 times the lines held. It was the first time the battle-hardened Romans had ever faced the disciplined wall of the Greek phalanx. The battlefield devolved into a bloody stalemate between the two greatest powers of the northern Mediterranean. Knowing that his death would instantly shatter his army's morale, Pyrrhus carefully traded armor with one of his officers. The disguise worked too well. The Roman infantry aggressively targeted the officer in the king's armor and killed him. Seeing the royal armor fall, the Greek soldiers believed Pyrrhus was dead. Panic ripped through the ranks. Realizing the danger, Pyrrhus tore off his helmet and rode furiously down the line, exposing his face to prove he was still alive. The sight of their king restored their courage, and the Greeks plunged back into the slaughter. To break the deadlock, Pyrrhus finally unleashed his war elephants. The Romans had never seen these massive beasts. The sheer size and violence of the animals sent shockwaves of panic through the infantry, while the Roman horses were completely terrified, throwing their riders and refusing commands. The Roman formation shattered. Seizing the moment, Pyrrhus ordered a final cavalry charge that drove the Romans back across the river. The cost of the victory was staggering. Rome lost 7,000 men with another 1,800 captured, but Pyrrhus lost 4,000 of his absolute best elites. Rome immediately absorbed the loss, went on the defensive, and began drafting fresh recruits from within the city. Pyrrhus marched north, plundering his way through Campania toward Latium. but achieved no strategic breakthrough before winter forced both sides to camp. The following spring, the armies clashed again at Asculum. Rome lost a second time, but the Greek casualties were so catastrophic that Pyrrhus famously despaired. "If we are victorious in one more battle with the Romans, we shall be utterly ruined." At this critical moment, the empire of Carthage entered the geopolitical board. Carthage wanted to conquer the Greek cities in Sicily, and they knew those cities would beg Pyrrhus for protection. To keep Pyrrhus trapped in Italy, Carthage allied with Rome, offering military support. Bolstered by Carthaginian backing, Rome flatly refused to negotiate with Pyrrhus. Realizing the Italian campaign was bleeding him dry, Pyrrhus abandoned the peninsula and sailed for Sicily to fight Carthage. For 3 years, he tore through Carthaginian forces, conquering so much territory that he began planning a naval invasion of Africa itself. But his autocratic rule terrified the Sicilian Greeks. Cities began defecting to Carthage while others plotted to overthrow him. Stripped of his allies and facing a massive betrayal, Pyrrhus abandoned Sicily. He took his depleted army back to Italy to answer one final plea from the Samnites to fight Rome. The decisive showdown came in 275 BC at Beneventum. This time, the Romans were ready for the war elephants. Commanded by Manius Curius Dentatus, the legions aggressively targeted the beasts, panicking them into trampling their own Greek infantry. The Greek lines collapsed. In the chaos, the Romans captured 8 of the surviving elephants, delivering a crushing final defeat to Pyrrhus. Broken and drained of manpower, Pyrrhus retreated to Tarentum. His dream of a Western Mediterranean empire was dead. Shortly after, he sailed back to Epirus in defeat. In 272 BC, the Roman army besieged and captured the isolated city of Tarentum. Aside from the Gauls in the northern Po Valley, the entire Italian peninsula now belonged to Rome. Rome did not rule this massive territory as a highly centralized authoritarian state. Instead, they engineered a highly sophisticated, tiered system of alliances. The first method was direct incorporation. The Latins, most of Campania, the southern Etruscans, and the Sabines were absorbed directly into the state, granted full or partial Roman citizenship. The second method was the alliance network. The northern Etruscans, the mountain tribes, and the southern Greeks were classified as either Latin allies or Italian allies, with the Latins holding a slightly higher political status. They were allowed to govern themselves and keep their internal laws. In exchange, they owed Rome 2 things. They had to supply troops for the Roman war machine, and they had to surrender their foreign policy to the Roman Senate. But the system was anchored by one specific, calculated restriction. Whether they were half-citizens or bound allies, very few of these conquered people held voting rights in Rome. They could not dictate the core policies of the Republic. By utilizing this flexible hierarchy, Rome tied dozens of different tribes and cities directly to its own authority without handing over political control. By unifying Italy, Rome secured an endless, highly stable pool of military manpower. They possessed a massive army and a completely secure home front. The conquest of the Mediterranean was ready to begin. Beyond the peninsula, the First Punic War and the Gallic threat. By defeating the Greek king Pyrrhus and capturing Tarentum, Rome effectively unified the Italian peninsula. Aside from the Gauls holding the northern Po Valley, the Romans controlled it all. But this expansion pushed the borders of the Republic to the coastline. Looking across the sea to Sicily, Rome now stood face to face with Carthage. Carthage was a Phoenician overseas colony known to the Romans as the Punics. Built on a perfect geographic choke point, It had monopolized trade across the western Mediterranean, funneling staggering wealth into its capital. The Carthaginian state was run by wealthy merchants and elite landowners. To protect their sprawling maritime trade routes, they developed a massive, historically unrivaled navy. For a long time, Carthage and Rome maintained a comfortable friendship. But as their borders finally collided, a geopolitical clash was inevitable. The spark was lit in 288 BC, while Rome was still tied down by conflicts with the Samnites. The ruler of Syracuse, a Greek colony in Sicily, died. Without a paymaster, his unemployed mercenaries seized the nearby city of Messina, setting up a rogue state and raiding the countryside. Years later, in 264 BC, Syracuse finally marched on Messina to wipe them out. Outgunned, the mercenaries panicked and sent desperate pleas for military aid to both Carthage and Rome. In Rome, the Senate hesitated. They despised mercenaries and deeply distrusted their motives. Furthermore, the senators were bitterly divided over the risks of deploying troops to Sicily. Intervening meant directly threatening Carthage's core interests, and the Senate paralyzed itself in debate. Carthage did not wait. A Carthaginian fleet happened to be patrolling nearby. When the request for help arrived, they immediately sailed into Messina. Seeing a superpower enter the field, the Syracusan army backed down without a fight. But once the Carthaginian military secured Messina, they refused to leave, intending to permanently occupy the city. The Roman Senate was still deadlocked, so they handed the final decision to the Centuriate Assembly. The voting citizens made the call. Rome had to secure its southern flank. They voted to send the legions to Sicily. Because of this vote, the First Punic War officially erupted in 264 BC. The Romans struck first and struck hard. Their initial assault captured Messina and forced the Carthaginian army to retreat. The legions then marched straight down to Syracuse, forcing the city to surrender and ally with Rome. Now fighting together, the Romans and Syracusans pushed further into Carthaginian territory. Carthage did not back down over a single lost city. Instead, they poured massive reinforcements into Agrigentum, a major stronghold in the south. In 262 BC, the Roman infantry crushed these reinforcements and took the city. Rome was undefeated on land, but strategically the war remained a stalemate. Carthage controlled a massive Mediterranean fleet. They used this navy to blockade the Italian coast and isolate Sicily, completely cutting off the Roman supply lines. Facing starvation and an impenetrable Carthaginian blockade, Rome made a radical decision. They would build a fleet from scratch. To survive in the Mediterranean, they had to conquer the sea. Rome aggressively harvested timber and built over 100 warships in a single year, training their rowers on dry land. But sending a raw, inexperienced fleet to fight the ancient maritime empire of Carthage was a death sentence. To close the skill gap, Roman engineers designed a specialized boarding bridge called the corvus. This heavy wooden ramp featured a massive iron spike at the end. When a Roman ship rammed an enemy vessel, the bridge would slam down, driving the spike deep into the Carthaginian deck and locking the two ships together. The device neutralized Carthage's superior sailing tactics. If a Roman ship could simply get close enough, the corvus turned a naval battle into a brutal infantry melee, the exact kind of warfare the Romans had already mastered. In 260 BC, the two fleets collided at Cape Mylae, each fielding over 100 ships. The corvus worked flawlessly. In its first major naval engagement, Rome decimated the Carthaginian fleet. Following this victory, dozens of Sicilian cities defected to Rome. With victories on both land and sea, the Roman Senate looked across the Mediterranean and made a massive gamble. They would invade the Carthaginian homeland directly. In 256 BC, the two empires launched over 300 ships each into the Battle of Cape Ecnomus, one of the largest naval battles in human history. Carthage was broken again, leaving the sea lane to North Africa wide open. Shortly after, the Roman expeditionary force landed on Carthaginian soil. But for the Romans, the invasion quickly deteriorated into a nightmare. The scorching African climate exhausted the troops, and the massive walls of Carthage proved impenetrable. As the siege dragged on, the cost of feeding and supplying the army skyrocketed. To manage the crisis, the Roman command split its forces. The consul Regulus remained in Africa with 20,000 men and 40 ships, while the other consul took the remaining fleet back to Italy to transport reinforcements. Carthage instantly exploited the divided Roman army. They overhauled their forces, brought in new mercenary commanders, and cornered Regulus at the Battle of the Bagradas River. Outmaneuvered on the flat African plains, the Roman expeditionary force was annihilated. Only 2,000 men survived, and Regulus himself was taken prisoner. In 255 BC, the Roman relief fleet finally arrived, only to find the army destroyed. They loaded the shattered survivors and ordered a retreat to Italy, but the Mediterranean was not done with them. On the voyage home, the fleet sailed directly into a catastrophic storm. Hundreds of Roman warships were driven into the rocks. Over 80,000 men drowned, and the armada was almost entirely wiped out in a single day. Following the African disaster, the war shifted back to Sicily, grinding into a brutal, decade-long war of attrition. It took until 241 BC for Rome to finally capture the last Carthaginian stronghold on the island. By this point, both empires were drained of manpower. But Carthage broke first. With their treasury completely empty and no way to sustain the financial drain, they sent envoys to Rome to beg for peace. The terms were merciless. Carthage was forced to surrender Sicily and all surrounding islands, pay a massive indemnity of 3,200 talents of silver, and release every Roman prisoner of war without ransom. After 23 consecutive years of slaughter, the First Punic War was over. Sicily was annexed, becoming the very first overseas province of the Roman Republic. The war left Carthage crippled. Without silver, they could not pay the wages of their surviving mercenary armies. The unpaid soldiers mutinied, sparking a massive and bloody internal rebellion. In 238 BC, a garrison of Carthaginian mercenaries stationed on the island of Sardinia joined the revolt, but they went a step further. They offered the island to Rome. The Romans happily accepted the stolen territory. They launched an invasion force and annexed both Sardinia and Corsica. Bogged down in their own civil war, the Carthaginians were powerless to stop it. They were forced to swallow the humiliation and surrender two vital strategic islands. With Carthage temporarily neutralized, Rome snapped its attention back north to an old enemy, the Gauls of the Po Valley. Ever since the Gauls burned Rome to the ground centuries earlier, these northern tribes had launched periodic raiding campaigns down the peninsula, forcing the Romans into a permanent defensive posture. Cisalpine Gaul remained a dagger pointed at the heart of the Republic. In 225 BC, the tribes of Cisalpine Gaul allied with the Transalpine Gauls across the mountains. They amassed an army of 70,000 warriors and marched south, striking directly at the Etruscan city of Clusium. For the Romans, this looked exactly like the nightmare that had nearly destroyed their civilization. To meet the threat, Rome mobilized the entire Republic. They drafted men from across central and southern Italy, assembling a colossal force of 130,000 soldiers to march north. Simultaneously, they ordered the legions stationed in Sardinia to land at Pisa, cutting off the Gallic escape route. Trapped in a massive strategic pincer, the Gallic horde was crushed. The following year, the Roman army pressed the advantage, intent on permanently eradicating the Gallic threat. They crossed the Po River and shattered the remaining tribal armies. After 3 years of relentless military sweeps, the majority of the Cisalpine Gauls surrendered in 221 BC. While Rome did not fully assimilate the northern tribes, they completely broke their capacity to wage war. To lock down the region, Rome constructed 2 major military highways driving straight into the north and fortified the vital port cities of Genoa and Lucca. This infrastructure cemented Rome's defensive grip over northern Italy. However, while Rome was pouring its military strength into pacifying the Gauls, Carthage bought itself time to breathe. Under the brilliant command of Hamilcar Barca, the Carthaginians violently suppressed their mercenary rebellion and began rebuilding their empire. Using the heavy Roman war reparations as a cover to avoid suspicion, Carthage quietly funneled its resources into the Iberian Peninsula. By conquering Spain, they secured vast silver mines and endless manpower, replacing the wealth and strategic depth they had lost in the First Punic War. By the time Rome finally subdued the Gauls, Carthage's Spanish Empire, built by Hamilcar's successor Hasdrubal and later by Hannibal, was generating massive wealth. Carthage was mining fresh silver and training new armies. As the Roman Senate watched this rapid resurrection from across the sea, they realized the peace treaties had settled nothing. The 2 empires were not sharing the Mediterranean. They were simply arming themselves for the next war. The Century of Blood, Hannibal, and the Second Punic War. After the First Punic War, Carthage was brought to its knees. Crushed by massive Roman war reparations and bleeding from a brutal mercenary rebellion, the empire hit rock bottom. But the victors in Rome quickly turned their attention north, locked in a bitter conflict with their old enemy, the Gauls. This distraction gave Carthage exactly what it needed: time to breathe. In 237 BC, the Carthaginian general Hamilcar Barca began violently carving out a new colonial empire in the Iberian Peninsula. To keep the Roman Senate pacified, he claimed this conquest was simply a way to mine enough silver to pay their war debts. It was a lie. Over a decade of relentless campaigning, Hamilcar rebuilt Carthaginian military power. After his death, his son-in-law Hasdrubal took command, extracting staggering wealth from Spain and negotiating a strict border treaty with Rome. Carthage would control everything south of the Ebro River, and Rome would control the north. But in 221 BC, Hasdrubal was assassinated, and command fell to Hamilcar's son, Hannibal. Hannibal was aggressive. He rapidly expanded his territory, pushing his armies all the way to the Ebro River border. Just south of this border sat Saguntum, an independent city deeply afraid of Carthaginian expansion. Saguntum appealed to Rome for protection, and Rome agreed. To Hannibal, this was a blatant violation of the treaty. Rome had crossed the line. Because of this, in 219 BC, Hannibal laid siege to Saguntum and destroyed it. The news outraged the Roman Senate. They sent envoys to Carthage demanding Hannibal's surrender, but diplomacy completely collapsed. In the spring of 218 BC, Rome formally declared war. The Second Punic War had begun. Rome mobilized its legions following their standard military doctrine. They split their forces in 2. One army would sail south to strike the Carthaginian homeland directly, while the other would sail west to invade Spain. But Hannibal refused to fight a defensive war, leaving 10,000 men with his brother Hasdrubal to secure Spain. Hannibal gathered his main army and marched north. He intended to invade the Italian peninsula by land, striking directly at the heart of Rome. This overland strategy was considered borderline suicidal. It required Hannibal to drag an army across brutal geographic barriers, navigate hostile Gallic territory, and maintain a massive supply line. After crossing the Pyrenees, he commanded 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. As the horde marched along the southern coast of Gaul toward the Rhone River, the Roman general Scipio, who had just landed nearby, caught wind of their movements. Scipio immediately moved to block the river crossing. After a brief skirmish between their scouting cavalry, Hannibal realized the Romans were waiting for him. Instead of engaging and risking his main force, he violently pivoted. He abandoned the coastal route and marched north directly into the treacherous peaks of the Alps. Rome had no idea where he had gone. In the autumn of 218 BC, Hannibal's army reached the foot of the Alps. What followed was a logistical nightmare. The freezing temperatures, deep snow, and sheer cliffs were devastating, but the local mountain tribes were worse. One day, native guides led the Carthaginian army into a narrow, winding gorge. Hannibal was immediately suspicious. Halfway through the pass, the trap was sprung. Gallic warriors ambushed them from the cliffs above, raining arrows and boulders down onto the helpless column. Fighting in a severe bottleneck, Hannibal desperately organized a bloody, chaotic push to break out of the valley. It took another grueling 2 weeks to finally cross the summit. When the Carthaginians descended into the northern Italian plains that November, the cost of the march was horrifying. Hannibal had lost more than half his men. He was left with just 20,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and a handful of surviving elephants. But Hannibal's arrival acted as a massive catalyst. The northern Italian Gauls, who had recently been slaughtered by Roman legions, saw an opportunity for vengeance. Hearing that a Carthaginian warlord was marching on Rome, Gallic warriors flooded into Hannibal's camp, swelling his ranks back to over 40,000 men. When the Roman Senate realized Hannibal had crossed the Alps, panic set in. They urgently recalled the army preparing to invade Africa, ordering the consul Sempronius to rush back and defend the homeland. Meanwhile, Scipio's northern forces finally caught up to the Carthaginians. At the Battle of Ticinus, Hannibal's superior cavalry easily routed the Romans. Scipio was severely wounded, forcing his battered legions to retreat south of the Po River. Shortly after, the reinforcements under Sempronius finally arrived and merged with Scipio's survivors. Sempronius was aggressive, desperate for a decisive victory. In late December, he ordered the legions to engage Hannibal at the Trebia River. Hannibal dictated exactly how the battle would unfold. The night before, he ordered his younger brother Mago to hide 2,000 elite soldiers in the tall brush along the riverbank. The next morning, heavy snow blanketed the battlefield. Hannibal sent his light Numidian cavalry across the river to harass the Roman camp. Sempronius took the bait. Enraged, he ordered his entire army out of their tents and launched an immediate counterattack. The Numidians feigned a retreat, dragging the exhausted, freezing Roman infantry through the icy waters of the Trebia. When the Romans reached the far bank, they slammed directly into Hannibal's fully prepared, well-rested infantry. The Roman cavalry was quickly overwhelmed and driven from the field, leaving the infantry flanks completely exposed. As the Carthaginian line pressed inward, Mago's hidden forces erupted from the brush and struck the Romans from behind. Trapped and freezing, the Roman formation disintegrated, while the heavy infantry in the center managed to violently carve their way out of the trap. The rest of the army was slaughtered. Out of 40,000 Romans, barely 10,000 survived. The disaster at Trebia made Hannibal a legend, drawing even more northern Gauls to his banner. In the spring of 217 BC, the Roman Senate drafted new legions and elected two new consuls, Servilius and Flaminius. They positioned their massive armies to block the two main highways leading south. Their strategy was simple. If they held the roads, Hannibal could not reach Rome unless he marched through an impassable, deadly expanse of untamed swamps. So Hannibal marched into the swamps. For 4 agonizing days, the Carthaginian army waded through deep mud and disease-ridden waters. The conditions were so horrific that Hannibal lost an eye to a severe infection. But the gamble worked. He bypassed the Roman blockade entirely, erupting into Etruria and burning the countryside to the ground. Furious, the consul Flaminius took 25,000 men and raced to catch him. Hannibal constantly stayed one step ahead, drawing the Romans further south until mid-June, when he found the perfect terrain, Lake Trasimene. The lake was bordered by steep, wooded hills, creating a narrow geographical bottleneck. Hannibal camped at the far end of this pass. Under the cover of night, he marched his infantry along the backside of the hills, hiding them in the dense slopes overlooking the road. The next morning, a thick fog rolled off the water. Unaware of the trap, Flaminius ordered his legions to march east along the narrow shoreline. Just as the Roman vanguard reached the end of the pass, the hills erupted. Thousands of Carthaginian and Gallic infantry poured down the slopes, slamming into the Roman flank. Simultaneously, Hannibal's cavalry swept down to block the rear. Trapped in a marching column, the Romans had absolutely no room to form their battle lines. Blinded by the fog and attacked from 3 sides, the legions were pinned against the water. The battle lasted just 3 hours. It was a flawless textbook ambush. For the cost of 1,500 men, Hannibal wiped out an entire Roman army. 15,000 Romans were butchered, including the consul Flaminius. But Hannibal did not immediately march on the city of Rome. Instead, he moved toward the Adriatic coast, enacting a brilliant psychological strategy. He executed the Roman prisoners, but released all the captured soldiers from Rome's allied cities without demanding a ransom. His goal was to shatter the Roman alliance network from the inside. When news of the slaughter reached the capital, the Senate descended into sheer terror. Realizing the state was facing total annihilation, they triggered their extreme emergency protocol, appointing Fabius Maximus as dictator with absolute authority. Fabius was a pragmatist. He understood that Hannibal was fighting a war of attrition thousands of miles from home, with no reliable supply line. Because of this, Fabius instituted a radical, deeply unpopular strategy: delay. He flatly refused to engage Hannibal in open combat. Instead, he shadowed the Carthaginian army, burning crops, cutting off foraging parties, and bleeding Hannibal's logistics dry. Militarily, this scorched earth strategy was highly effective, but politically, it was a disaster. As Hannibal burned Italian farms with impunity, the Roman public demanded blood. War hawks in the Senate openly branded Fabius a coward, and his own soldiers began to despise him. In 216 BC, the dictatorship of Fabius expired. The Senate replaced him with 2 new consuls, Varro, an aggressive war hawk, and Paulus, a cautious tactician. To completely annihilate the Carthaginian threat, Rome initiated the largest military draft in its history. They assembled 8 full legions, over 86,000 men, doubling the size of Hannibal's army. Placing two consuls in command of a single massive force was an unprecedented move, reflecting the sheer desperation of the Republic. By Roman law, the two consuls rotated supreme command every single day. Because Varro and Paulus had wildly different strategic philosophies, the movements of the largest army in Roman history became violently erratic. That spring, the legions marched south, tracking Hannibal to the ruined town of Cannae on the Aufidus River. The armies camped just 5 miles apart. On a day Varro held command, Hannibal launched a probing cavalry attack. Varro immediately committed his forces and drove the Carthaginians back. Emboldened by this minor victory, Varro wanted to force a decisive battle. Paulus vehemently objected. The next day, when Paulus took command, he split the massive army into 2 separate, heavily fortified camps across the river, refusing to fight. Hannibal quickly read the dynamic between the two commanders. To force an engagement, he targeted the Roman water supply. Under the brutal heat of the southern Italian summer, Hannibal's Numidian cavalry relentlessly harassed and slaughtered the Roman soldiers trying to collect water from the river. The provocation worked perfectly. Deprived of water and humiliated by the skirmishers, the Roman legions demanded a fight. On the morning of August 2nd, 216 BC, Varro took command and ordered the entire Roman army out of their camps. The two forces formed their battle lines on the plains of Cannae. The Romans fielded 80,000 infantry and over 6,000 cavalry. Hannibal stood against them with just 37,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry. The Romans deployed in a traditional formation. Heavy infantry in the center, flanked by cavalry. Remembering how the heavy infantry had carved through the Carthaginian lines at the Trebia River, the Roman command made a fateful decision. They drastically narrowed their front line, packing the soldiers incredibly deep. They intended to use their massive weight to act as a battering ram, punching straight through the Carthaginian center. Hannibal saw the battering ram forming, and he designed a massive tactical illusion. He deployed his weakest troops, the Iberian and Gallic infantry, in the very center of his line, bowing the formation outward toward the Romans. He placed his elite, heavily armored African infantry behind them on the extreme left and right flanks. Finally, he positioned his superior cavalry on the wings. The entire Carthaginian formation looked like a massive, outward-facing crescent moon. The horns blew, and the cavalry charged. In the center, the massive Roman infantry block raised their shields, drew their short swords, and marched forward like a massive meat grinder. As the armies collided, the roar of shattered shields and dying men echoed across the plain. Under the crushing, concentrated weight of the Roman advance, Hannibal's weak center immediately began to buckle. The Gauls and Iberians gave ground, stepping backward. As they retreated, the Carthaginian line inverted, turning from an outward-facing crescent into a deep, concave pocket. Hannibal stood directly in the center of the line, fighting alongside his men to ensure the retreat was controlled and didn't turn into a total rout. Believing the enemy center was breaking, the Roman infantry surged forward, pouring into the collapsing pocket. But as they pushed deeper, they walked directly between the two columns of elite African infantry anchored on the flanks. The Carthaginians suddenly pivoted inward, attacking the Romans from both sides. The immense Roman army was compressed. The soldiers were packed so tightly together that they could not even raise their weapons to defend themselves. At that exact moment, Hannibal's heavy cavalry, having completely shattered the Roman horsemen on the wings, wheeled around and slammed into the rear of the Roman infantry. The trap snapped shut. Hannibal had executed a perfect double envelopment. 80,000 Romans were locked inside a seamless circle of slaughter. Stripped of all tactical mobility, The legions were reduced to livestock. The Carthaginians butchered the tightly packed Romans for hours, continuing the execution until the sun finally set. Out of 86,000 Roman soldiers, over 70,000 were killed or captured. The consul Paulus was killed in the carnage, while Varro barely escaped with his life. Hannibal had achieved the impossible, wiping out the largest army in Roman history at the cost of just 6,000 to 8,000 men. The disaster at Cannae was apocalyptic. An entire generation of Roman men was wiped out in a single afternoon. But in its darkest hour, the true, terrifying nature of the Roman Republic revealed itself. The Senate refused to break. They outright rejected all peace negotiations and legally outlawed public weeping in the streets of Rome, forcing the city to swallow its grief. To rebuild the army, the state pushed its citizens to the absolute limit. They doubled property taxes and drafted every male over the age of 17. When that wasn't enough, they resorted to arming thousands of slaves. Wealthy patricians emptied their private vaults to fund the war effort, and the surviving Roman soldiers refused to accept their wages until Hannibal was defeated. Strategically, Rome abandoned the delusion of a decisive pitched battle and fully embraced the Fabian strategy of delay. Driven by an unbreakable political will and highly centralized state mobilization, Rome entirely replaced its lost legions before the end of the year. Hannibal had executed a flawless tactical victory, but strategically, he was trapped. Although several southern Italian cities defected to Carthage after Cannae, they could not provide the manpower or supplies he needed to conquer the capital. The brilliant Carthaginian warlord was now locked into a grueling, endless war of attrition against a republic that simply refused to die. The final reckoning, from the ashes of Cannae to the destruction of Carthage. In 216 BC, the Roman Republic bled out on the plains of Cannae. Seeing Hannibal's seemingly unstoppable momentum, the southern Greek city-states wavered. Major strongholds like Capua defected. The following year, the heavyweight city of Syracuse in Sicily allied with Carthage, but the core of central Italy held the line. Following the Senate's iron directives, these allies remained fiercely loyal to Rome. The Republic scraped together fresh manpower and doubled down on the Fabian strategy of delay, locking down the countryside to starve the Carthaginian army. Hannibal, meanwhile, was strategically stranded. He had lost contact with the Gauls in the north, and the Carthaginian navy was too weak to ship reinforcements across the Mediterranean. He was forced into a grinding, localized stalemate in the south, fighting a war of attrition with limited men. Sensing Roman weakness, King Philip V of Macedon sent a letter to Hannibal, offering a military alliance. In exchange for his help, Hannibal promised to hand over Rome's Balkan territories once the Republic fell. But Macedonian spies were intercepted on their journey home, and the letters fell into Roman hands. The Senate realized they were facing a multi-front war. Instead of pulling back, they immediately dispatched a fleet of 50 warships to the Illyrian coast to monitor the Macedonians. When Philip V invaded Oricum in 214 BC, sparking the First Macedonian War, Rome simply deployed a general and opened a new front, refusing to yield an inch of ground. The war in Sicily was just as brutal, centered around the siege of Syracuse. The city's defense was masterminded by Archimedes, one of history's greatest mathematicians and physicists. In 215 BC, the Roman general Marcellus launched a naval assault, expecting a swift surrender. Instead, his fleet was bombarded by massive boulders launched from custom-built catapults, forcing the ships to retreat. But distance offered no safety. Suddenly, Roman galleys began to catch fire. Archimedes had designed an array of parabolic mirrors, focusing the blinding heat of the sun directly onto the wooden hulls. Bleeding ships and men, the Roman military abandoned the naval assault and settled for a long, grueling blockade. The city finally broke in 212 BC. When Roman soldiers breached the walls and stormed into Archimedes' home, they found the 75-year-old man staring at geometric figures drawn in the dust. A soldier drew his sword and ordered the old man to stand. Archimedes simply snapped at him not to step on his circles. Enraged, the soldier cut him down. When Marcellus heard the news, he was furious. He executed the soldier and ordered a grand military funeral for the brilliant mathematician. That same year, the broader war violently shifted across multiple fronts. In Italy, Hannibal marched out of Capua and captured Tarentum, but Rome immediately countered by laying siege to Capua. After failing multiple times to break the Roman blockade, Hannibal watched Capua surrender. Stripped of his primary base, he was forced to retreat deep into the southern mountains. In Spain, Rome suffered a bitter setback when the elder Scipio was killed in action due to a tactical error. The following year, the Senate sent his son, the younger Scipio, to take command and salvage the Iberian front. In 209 BC, the younger Scipio defeated the Carthaginian general Hasdrubal Barca, but failed to wipe out his army. Hasdrubal slipped past the Roman pursuit, leading 30,000 men over the Alps to join his brother Hannibal in Italy. By this point, Hannibal had lost Tarentum and was entirely surrounded. This northern relief force was his only remaining hope. But Hasdrubal's messengers were intercepted. Rome discovered the exact route of the reinforcement army. The consuls Nero and Livius rapidly mobilized, cornering Hasdrubal at the Battle of the Metaurus. The Carthaginian army was annihilated, and Hasdrubal was killed. Days later, a Roman rider approached Hannibal's camp and tossed a severed head over the barricades. The brothers had been separated for a decade. This was their reunion. Stripped of his family and his only reinforcements, Hannibal was completely isolated. The momentum violently shifted to Rome. In 206 BC, Scipio crushed the remaining Carthaginian forces at the Battle of Ilipa, securing total Roman dominance over Spain. After a year of intense preparation, Scipio took the war to the enemy, landing a Roman invasion force in North Africa in 204 BC. He tore through Carthaginian defenses and successfully convinced the elite Numidian cavalry to defect to Rome. Panicked, the Carthaginian government recalled Hannibal from Italy and sued for peace. But the moment Hannibal landed in Africa with his veterans, the politicians changed their minds and chose to fight. In October 202 BC, the two greatest commanders of the age met on the plains of Zama. Hannibal fielded 36,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, and 80 war elephants. Scipio deployed 29,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. Thanks to the Numidian defectors, Rome held a massive advantage in mounted warfare. To neutralize the terrifying charge of the elephants, Scipio completely altered the Roman formation. Instead of overlapping his lines into a solid wall, he arranged the legions in neat columns, leaving wide, vertical corridors running straight through the infantry. When the battle began, Hannibal ordered the elephants to charge. At that exact moment, Scipio ordered his men to blow massive brass horns. The deafening noise panicked the beasts. Many elephants spun around and crashed directly into the Carthaginian cavalry on the left wing, shattering their own lines. The Roman cavalry immediately charged, exploiting the chaos. Meanwhile, the elephants that did charge forward naturally funneled into the empty corridors Scipio had prepared. They ran straight through the Roman army without inflicting serious casualties. The elephant threat was completely neutralized. The Roman infantry reorganized into a solid wall and marched forward. Hannibal committed his frontline troops. The battlefield devolved into a suffocating clash of shields and short swords. As the front ranks were butchered, fresh men stepped up over the corpses to hold the line. Both commanders knew the battle would be decided by the cavalry. After routing the Carthaginian horsemen on the wings, the Roman cavalry did not chase them into the desert. Instead, they wheeled around and charged directly into the rear of Hannibal's infantry. The Carthaginian army was completely surrounded. It was Cannae all over again, but this time the trap had snapped shut on Hannibal. Over 20,000 Carthaginians were slaughtered at Zama. Rome lost barely 5,000 men. Carthage's military capacity was completely broken. With the prospect of a massive drawn-out siege of the capital looming, both sides agreed that a treaty was the only viable path forward. In 201 BC, Rome imposed a ruthless peace. Carthage surrendered all overseas territories. They were allowed to keep exactly 10 warships. The rest were handed over to Rome. They were hit with a massive indemnity of 10,000 talents of silver, to be paid over 50 years. They were legally forbidden from declaring war on anyone without explicit Roman permission. Finally, they were forced to recognize the Roman ally Massinissa as the king of Numidia. Carthage was effectively reduced to a Roman vassal, and Rome became the undisputed master of the Western Mediterranean. Following the Second Punic War, Rome focused its military on Macedon, Gaul, and Spain, but never stopped watching Carthage. Despite being militarily castrated, Carthage experienced a massive economic boom under Hannibal's brilliant post-war governance. This rapid financial recovery terrified Rome and angered Hannibal's political rivals at home. Facing political persecution and the looming threat of being handed over to Rome, Hannibal was forced into exile. He sought refuge with King Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire, staying one step ahead of Roman assassins until he finally took his own life in 183 BC. Even with Hannibal dead, Rome wanted Carthage erased. The Roman senator Cato famously ended every speech with the same unyielding demand: Carthage must be destroyed. With the Senate intent on annihilation, finding a pretext was easy. Backed by Rome, the Numidian king Massinissa began aggressively annexing Carthaginian territory. He supplied Rome with grain and elephants while deliberately provoking border skirmishes. Under the terms of the treaty, Carthage repeatedly appealed to Rome for justice, but the Senate ruled in favor of Numidia every single time. In 150 BC, pushed past the breaking point, Carthage finally mobilized an army to defend its borders against Numidia. Rome instantly seized the excuse, accusing Carthage of violating the treaty by waging an unauthorized war. Rome formally declared the Third Punic War in 149 BC. The Carthaginian military was a shadow of its former self. Roman legions landed in Africa and easily encircled the capital. Facing total destruction, the Carthaginian government surrendered, handing over all their weapons and hostages. But Rome did not want peace. They wanted the city erased from the map. After disarming the population, Rome delivered its final ultimatum. The city of Carthage would be demolished, and all citizens had to relocate 10 miles inland. For a maritime civilization built entirely on sea trade, this was a death sentence. Left with no alternative, the unarmed Carthaginians chose to die fighting. Stripped of their formal military, the citizens of Carthage mounted a terrifying, desperate defense. Men and women forged makeshift weapons and held off the Roman siege machinery for 2 solid years. In 147 BC, the Roman command passed to Scipio Aemilianus. He systematically locked down the city, building a massive naval blockade, deep trenches, and fortified towers. He physically sealed Carthage off from the world. Starvation and disease swept through the population. The following spring, the Roman army finally breached the walls. The starving survivors refused to surrender. They fought the legions street by street and house by house. Roman soldiers had to smash through shared walls and fight pitched battles on the rooftops, throwing Carthaginian defenders into the burning streets below. It took 6 days of relentless, suffocating urban combat before the citadel finally fell. Rome leveled Carthage to the ground. The survivors were sold into slavery. Legend dictates that the Romans sowed the ruined earth with salt to ensure nothing would ever grow there again. As Scipio Aemilianus watched the 600-year-old city burn to ash, he wept, famously saying, "A day will come when our sacred Troy shall fall. I fear that someday someone will give this same order for my own country." The rise of the Roman Republic was not a seamless, inevitable march to glory. They had suffered catastrophic, nation-ending defeats. A slaughter on the scale of Cannae would have broken almost any other ancient civilization. But Rome absorbed the catastrophic losses, weaponized its entire population, and ground its greatest rival into the dirt. When the fires finally burned out in North Africa, the Mediterranean had only one master. Carthage was nothing but ash. The Republic fractures, blood, corruption, and the rise of Marius. After burning Carthage to the ground in the Third Punic War, Rome shifted its strategic focus toward conquering the eastern Mediterranean and the Iberian Peninsula. Between 190 and 140 BC, a relentless series of conflicts, the Macedonian, Seleucid, Galatian, and Lusitanian Wars, brought Illyria, Greece, Iberia, and Asia Minor under Roman control. The Mediterranean Sea was now effectively a Roman lake. Since the beginning of the First Punic War, the Republic had established 6 permanent overseas provinces: Sicily, Corsica, and Sardinia, nearer Spain, further Spain, Africa, and Macedonia. But conquering an empire is entirely different from governing one. This explosive territorial expansion brought unprecedented challenges. Rome had mutated from a small, impoverished city-state into a massive, unimaginably wealthy empire. The traditional systems used to govern a single city were completely inadequate for managing a continent. The Republic began to fracture under the weight of 2 deeply interconnected social crises: the extreme concentration of wealth and a devastating collapse in military manpower. To keep the empire moving, the state had to find a way to rebuild its armies. Managing these sprawling overseas territories required a massive military occupation. In the 2 Spanish provinces alone, Rome had to station 4 legions, a standing army of nearly 20,000 men. Rebellions erupted constantly. Macedonia revolted in 149 BC, Spain in 147 BC, and by 135 BC, a massive slave uprising involving 200,000 people tore through Sicily. To hold this territory, Rome needed a permanent, colossal military presence. Yet even as the borders expanded, the pool of eligible Roman soldiers was rapidly drying up. This was a direct result of the traditional Roman military system, which was strictly tied to property ownership. To serve in the legions, a citizen had to own a minimum amount of land. As the empire grew, wealthy aristocrats bought up the newly conquered territories, driving small farmers into bankruptcy. The moment a farmer lost his land, he lost his legal right to serve in the military. Some politicians proposed mitigating the crisis by encouraging higher birth rates or extending mandatory service years, but this only compounded the suffering of the lower classes, triggering fierce resistance from both the public and the soldiers. Looking at this severe manpower shortage, a newly elected tribune of the plebs named Tiberius Gracchus identified the root cause. Without land, plebeians could not fight. In 133 BC, he concluded that redistributing property was the only way to rebuild the military. He introduced a radical land reform bill, capping the amount of public land any single citizen could hold at 500 jugera, roughly 300 acres. A family could claim an additional 250 jugera per son, but the strict maximum limit per household was capped at 1,000 jugera. Any land exceeding this limit had to be surrendered to the state, redistributed to landless citizens, and legally barred from future sale or transfer. This legislation was a direct assault on the immense wealth of the Roman elite. Pushing through massive political resistance, Tiberius, his brother Gaius Gracchus, and his father-in-law Appius Claudius formed a three-man commission to aggressively enforce the redistribution. But overhauling the Roman agricultural system was a massive logistical undertaking that could not be finished in a single year. To ensure the reform survived, Tiberius broke deeply entrenched political traditions and ran for a consecutive term as tribune. The opposition seized this opportunity. Patrician senators launched a massive smear campaign, accusing Tiberius of attempting to crown himself king and overthrow the republic. Simultaneously, they organized an armed mob to sabotage the election. On voting day, the violence erupted. Tiberius and over 300 of his followers were bludgeoned to death in the public forum by a mob of senators and their thugs. The pioneer of reform died in a pool of blood. However, terrified by the sheer anger of the public, the Senate did not dare abolish the Land Commission immediately. The reforms crawled forward. Over the next 5 years, roughly 75,000 bankrupt farmers received new plots of land. A decade later, in 123 BC, Tiberius's younger brother, Gaius Gracchus, was elected tribune. Gaius expanded the scope of the reforms. He believed that fixing the manpower crisis required not just land redistribution at home, but establishing overseas colonies. More controversially, he argued that the only permanent solution to the manpower shortage was granting Roman citizenship to their Italian allies. This proposal completely destroyed his political base. The plebeians of Rome violently rejected the idea of sharing their exclusive citizenship. For the Roman underclass, citizenship meant tangible economic benefits, legal protections, and a share of the empire's spoils. They refused to let outsiders in. Having alienated his own supporters, Gaius was politically isolated. The conservative opposition systematically dismantled his laws, and in 118 BC, a brutal civil war broke out over the throne of Numidia, an old Roman ally in North Africa. 5 years later, a ruthless prince named Jugurtha won the war and seized the crown. Because Jugurtha had slaughtered a large number of Roman merchants during the conflict, the Roman Senate formally declared war in 111 BC. But Jugurtha understood the deep corruption rotting the Roman political class. He simply bribed the Roman commanding general Calpurnius Bestia, paying him a fortune to halt the offensive and negotiate a favorable peace. When the scandal broke in Rome, the public was furious. Riding this wave of outrage, the tribune Memmius passed a motion granting Jugurtha safe conduct to travel to Rome and testify about the bribes. But when Jugurtha took the stand, another tribune, who had already been bought by Numidian gold, used his veto power to grant Jugurtha the right to remain completely silent. The entire trial was reduced to a humiliating farce. While freely walking the streets of Rome, Jugurtha even tracked down a relative of his defeated rivals and had him assassinated in broad daylight. The political system was entirely paralyzed by money. As Jugurtha finally left the city, he looked back and famously sneered, "A city for sale and doomed to quick destruction if it can only find a buyer." The following year, Rome resumed the war in Numidia. But the Roman commanders remained cowardly and incompetent, leading armies with shattered discipline to repeated defeats. The situation only stabilized in 109 BC when the consul Metellus arrived to restore military order. Finally, in 105 BC, under the brilliant command of the consul Gaius Marius, Rome dragged itself out of the quagmire and won the war. The Jugurthan War exposed the catastrophic failures of the Roman military, collapsed discipline, deep corruption, and the sheer inability to draft enough men. Observing this, Marius tore up the centuries-old rulebook and rebuilt the Roman army from the ground up. He started by entirely abolishing the property requirement. The legions were now open to any Roman citizen, regardless of wealth. But since these landless recruits could not afford their own armor, Marius ordered the state treasury to manufacture and distribute standardized gear. Armed with uniform, high-quality equipment, the combat effectiveness of the legions skyrocketed. Marius didn't just change who fought, he changed how long they served. Early Roman soldiers were farmers drafted for a specific campaign and sent home when the fighting stopped. Marius replaced this with a continuous 16-year enlistment, transforming a seasonal militia into a permanent standing army. Because these poor citizens were abandoning their livelihoods to fight, the state had to pay them. Soldiers now received a fixed annual salary, enough to buy thousands of pounds of meat, and were promised land grants in conquered territories upon retirement. Finally, Marius reorganized the tactical structure. He divided the legion into 10 highly mobile cohorts, standardizing the total strength at roughly 4,500 men. Through brutal discipline and relentless physical conditioning, Marius drastically elevated the lethality of the individual soldier. This new highly lethal professional army crushed Jugurtha, annihilated massive invasions by Germanic tribes, and suppressed the Second Servile War in Sicily. Riding these massive victories, the people hailed Marius as the savior of Rome and the third founder of the city. But the reforms fundamentally rewired the psychology of the Roman military, planting the seeds for the destruction of the Republic. By removing the property requirement, Marius severed the military from civilian society. The highly professionalized soldiers began to view themselves as a separate class, openly despising unarmed civilians. More dangerously, the motivation for fighting had shifted. The early Romans fought for the survival of their farms and the honor of the state. The new landless recruits fought strictly for survival and wealth. This professional army desperately wanted wars of conquest to secure loot and land. Because the Senate frequently dragged its feet on paying veterans, the soldiers stopped looking to the state for their rewards. Instead, they pledged their loyalty directly to the generals who led them into battle, paid their wages, and secured their retirement land. Ambitious commanders exploited this shift, buying the blind loyalty of their troops with generous cuts of plunder. The social contract between the soldier and the Republic was broken. In the time of Marius, however, the terminal nature of these reforms was not yet obvious. What mattered immediately to his victorious soldiers was getting the land they were promised. In 100 BC, Marius was elected consul for the 6th time, and his political ally Saturninus served as tribune. Together, they drafted a massive land distribution bill. Any veteran who had served under Marius for 7 years, regardless of their background, would receive 100 jugera of land, largely in new overseas colonies. This legislation crossed a highly explosive political red line. Marius's army contained thousands of Italian allies who lacked Roman citizenship. If these allies received state land directly from Rome, they were effectively being treated as Roman citizens. History had already proven that any politician who attempted to expand citizenship rights was signing their own death warrant. Roman citizenship was an incredibly lucrative legal status, granting voting rights, marriage protections, property rights, and immunity from certain laws. For decades, Rome had used Italian manpower to conquer the Mediterranean, but the Roman patricians and the Roman mob aggressively hoarded all the wealth and land for themselves. The Italian allies knew exactly how valuable citizenship was, and the Roman public was willing to kill to keep them locked out. To force the land bill through, Saturninus relied on the physical intimidation of Marius's veterans. He resorted to extreme political violence, even assassinating a rival candidate to secure an office for a political ally. This blatant use of murder alienated his own supporters and fractured the reform movement. The situation spiraled out of control. A furious mob cornered Saturninus and his followers in the Senate House, tearing the roof off the building and stoning them to death with the heavy clay tiles. The death of Saturninus proved that the legal foundation of the Republic was completely shattered. The physical inviolability of the tribunes was now a meaningless concept, and the laws of the state had been entirely overwritten by mob violence. The Republic had crossed a point of no return. Moving forward, the future of the state would be dictated strictly by whoever controlled the mob and whoever controlled the army. The twilight of the Republic, the social war, and the dictatorship of Sulla. In the 2nd century BC, a series of massive foreign conquests transformed Rome from a poor, vulnerable state into the wealthy hegemon of the Mediterranean. But the sheer scale of the empire made it nearly impossible to govern. The distribution of military commands, the administration of provinces, and the allocation of citizenship created deeply entrenched social conflicts. Instead of resolving these issues, the Republic fractured under their weight. At the exact moment Rome reached the height of its global power, its political system began to collapse. Reformers like Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, Saturninus and Marius desperately tried to stabilize the state, but their efforts met brutal resistance. Political disputes devolved from peaceful legislation into blood in the streets. Out of this chaos, one man took an unprecedented step. He marched a Roman army into Rome itself, intending to save the state through sheer, brutal force. He became both the savior and the destroyer of the Roman constitution, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. To understand Sulla, we have to look at the social war. In 101 BC, the 56-year-old Gaius Marius led his newly reformed army to completely annihilate a massive Germanic invasion, saving the Republic from an existential threat. After the war, his soldiers demanded their reward. Marius had recruited thousands of landless peasants, promising them property upon retirement. To force this through, Marius allied with the tribune Saturninus, secured his 6th consulship, and pushed for radical reform. But distributing land and expanding Roman citizenship violently triggered the established elite and the Roman mob. Saturninus resorted to extreme political violence and was murdered by the public. The push to expand citizenship died with him. 9 years later, in 91 BC, a patrician tribune named Drusus revived the issue. To secure political power, he secretly negotiated with Rome's Italian allies, known as the Socii. Drusus hesitated to enact the reforms, but the allies grew desperate. An allied leader named Silo rallied support across the peninsula. However, a radical faction among the allies went too far, plotting to assassinate the Roman consuls. When Drusus uncovered the plot, he leaked it to the Senate. The warning backfired. The Roman public immediately suspected Drusus of conspiring with the enemy. That autumn, Drusus was assassinated. His death extinguished the last hope of the Italian allies. After 40 years of broken promises and dead reformers, the allies realized that peaceful political change was impossible. In 90 BC, led by the Marsi tribe, the Italian allies took up arms and launched a massive, coordinated rebellion against Rome. This became known as the Social War. Because of the Marian military reforms, the Allied armies fought with the exact same weapons, formations, and tactics as the Roman legions. The two sides locked into a series of horrific, highly lethal pitched battles. Initially, the Italian rebels held the upper hand. Seeing Roman weakness, neutral cities defected to the rebellion, and even long-standing Roman loyalists began to waver. To stop the bleeding, Rome was forced to make a massive political concession. The Senate passed a law granting immediate Roman citizenship to any allied city that remained loyal. The legislation worked. Wavering regions like Etruria and Umbria permanently anchored themselves to Rome. The following year, the rebel offensive in Etruria collapsed, and internal fractures began to tear the Italian coalition apart. Seizing the momentum, Rome passed another law, offering citizenship to any rebel who laid down his arms within 60 days. This shattered the rebellion's morale. In 88 BC, the Roman commander Cinna crushed the northern strongholds, while Sulla ruthlessly swept through Campania in the south. Aside from isolated pockets of resistance, the social war was over. Rome had won. The Republic survived, and the Allies paid for their citizenship in blood, permanently unifying the Italian peninsula into a single Roman state. But the victory was deeply toxic. The massive influx of new citizens poured gasoline on Rome's bitter partisan divides. Public declarations of treason, political frame-ups, and assassinations became standard tools of government. The rule of law was rapidly eroding. In the early 1st century BC, the eastern kingdom of Pontus aggressively expanded under King Mithridates VI, swallowing the Black Sea coastline and absorbing Greek city-states. Mithridates built alliances with Syria and Egypt, preparing to seize control of Asia Minor. For 2 decades, Rome had focused exclusively on the West, treating the East with a loose, negligent foreign policy. A collision between the expanding Pontic Empire and the Roman Republic was inevitable. In 88 BC, while Rome was suffocating in the social war, Mithridates exploited the unprotected eastern frontier and invaded Asia Minor, sparking the First Mithridatic War. Because Roman governors and tax collectors had ruthlessly exploited the region for years, the local populations did not resist the invasion. They welcomed the Pontic army as liberators. Mithridates took Asia Minor without a fight. He immediately orchestrated a highly coordinated apocalyptic massacre of Roman officials, merchants, and civilians living in the province. He then incited Athens and other Greek cities to break away from Rome. When the crisis reached Rome, the Senate desperately needed a commander. The political factions supporting Marius and Sulla fought a vicious political war over the command. Ultimately, the Senate appointed Sulla to lead the legions into Greece. But the political maneuvering did not stop. The moment Sulla left the capital, a pro-Marius tribune named Sulpicius forced through a radical new law. He not only pushed to distribute the newly enfranchised Italian citizens across all voting tribes, but he illegally stripped Sulla of his military command and handed it to Marius. Both men knew that whoever controlled the army stationed at Nola controlled the Republic. Sulla raced to the military camp with Marian agents in close pursuit. Sulla arrived first. Standing before his 5 legions, originally assembled to fight Pontus, he convinced his soldiers to march on Rome itself. The troops swore their loyalty to their general. In an unprecedented violation of Roman law, Sulla turned the legions around and pointed their swords directly at the capital. Rome was lightly defended and easily breached. After securing the city, Sulla ruthlessly established order. He addressed the public, framing himself as a victim forced to march on his homeland to protect it. Then he initiated a bloody purge, slaughtering and exiling the Marian faction. Sulla proved a terrifying new reality. In the face of overwhelming military force, the laws of the tribunes and the votes of the assembly were completely meaningless. After securing his political rear, Sulla took his legions and sailed for Greece. The moment he was gone, history repeated itself. The Roman consul Cinna revived the repealed laws. When he met resistance, Cinna rallied a rogue army, allied with the exiled general Marius, who had returned from North Africa, and violently recaptured Rome. Back in power, Marius and Cinna unleashed a psychotic wave of revenge. They orchestrated a massive bloody purge, executing dozens of Sulla's patrician allies. The two men manipulated the elections, securing the consulship for themselves in 86 BC, and began raising an army to march east and destroy Sulla. However, just 13 days into his 7th consulship, Marius suddenly died of an illness. Cinna assumed total control of Rome, heavily preparing his forces to hunt down Sulla in Greece. Sulla knew his enemies had captured Rome, but he made a cold calculation. Destroying the Pontic Empire took ultimate priority. When Sulla landed in Greece with 5 legions, the majority of the Greek cities allied with Mithridates immediately surrendered. Only Athens, held by the Pontic general Archelaus, stubbornly refused to break. In 86 BC, Archelaus fielded a massive coalition of 120,000 Pontic and Greek troops against Sulla's 40,000 Romans at Chaeronea. The battle ended in a catastrophic defeat for Archelaus. Barely 10,000 of his men survived the slaughter. When the news reached Mithridates, he was horrified. He emptied his kingdom's reserves and shipped 80,000 fresh troops to reinforce Archelaus. In 85 BC, the two armies met again at Orchomenus. The Pontic Greek coalition now boasted over 80,000 men, heavily supported by an elite cavalry and scythed chariots. Sulla's Roman legions numbered just over 30,000. The flat terrain at Orchomenus heavily favored the Pontic cavalry. Recognizing the danger, Sulla ordered his infantry to dig deep, wide trenches across the battlefield and erect heavy palisades to break the momentum of a cavalry charge. Archelaus saw what was happening and ordered a massive infantry assault to disrupt the Roman engineers. The sudden strike shattered the Roman front line. Panic swept through the engineers, and the Roman soldiers dropped their shovels and ran for the camp. Sulla knew that if the Pontic heavy cavalry charged the routing infantry, the entire Roman army would be annihilated. In a split second, Sulla spurred his horse, grabbed a standard, and rode directly into the fleeing mob. He screamed at his men, "Remember, Orchomenus, I will fight to the death, but if anyone asks where you abandoned your general Sulla, tell them, at Orchomenus." Ashamed by their general's physical courage, the fleeing soldiers stopped, closed ranks, and turned back to face the enemy. The decisive battle began. Archelaus placed his scythed chariots at the very front, his heavy infantry in the center, and flanked the massive formation with his cavalry. Sulla deployed the traditional Roman triple line, but intentionally thinned out the formation from front to back, placing his own cavalry on the wings. When the Pontic chariots initiated their full-speed charge, the Roman front line executed a pre-planned maneuver. They rapidly stepped back, exposing a dense field of sharpened wooden stakes hammered into the ground. Simultaneously, the Roman skirmishers in the rear unleashed a devastating volley of heavy javelins. Moving at top speed, the chariots could not dodge the stakes or the javelin rain. Horses screamed, axles shattered, and the Pontic vanguard dissolved into violent chaos. The terrified surviving horses spun around and blindly charged back into their own lines, trampling the Pontic infantry and tearing the formation apart. Seizing the critical opening, the Roman legions drew their swords and advanced. Archelaus desperately tried to reform his chaotic infantry while ordering his cavalry to charge the Roman flanks, but the Roman infantry and cavalry locked into a flawless, coordinated defense, absorbing the charge and eventually breaking the Pontic horsemen. Knowing the battle was lost, Archelaus ordered a retreat back to his fortified camp. Sulla showed no mercy. He aggressively pursued the routing army, surrounded the camp, and ordered a direct assault. The Roman legions breached the defenses. Because the camp was backed against a deep, impassable swamp, the Pontic army was entirely trapped. Archelaus's forces were completely annihilated. After Orchomenus, Pontic influence was violently purged from Greece. Mithridates' ambition to conquer the Balkans was crushed, and his newly conquered territories in Asia Minor began to rebel. Meanwhile, Sulla was out of time. Instead of pushing deeper into Asia Minor to destroy Pontus entirely, he desperately needed to secure the political power in Rome. Mithridates also needed time to rebuild. In 84 BC, the two men quietly signed a peace treaty. Rome secured its eastern border, and Pontus survived. While Sulla was fighting Archelaus in Greece, the massive army raised by the consul Cinna crossed the sea into the east. Commanded by the general Flaccus and his deputy Fimbria, this army was designed to fight Pontus and keep a tight watch on Sulla. But the expeditionary force was tearing itself apart. During a mutiny, Flaccus was murdered, and Fimbria seized command. With the Pontic threat neutralized, Fimbria's army and Sulla's legions found themselves locked in a tense standoff at Thyatira. Fimbria never realized that his own soldiers vastly preferred the battle-hardened, victorious Sulla. A massive defection triggered the collapse of Fimbria's command. Trapped and abandoned, Fimbria committed suicide. Sulla absorbed the entire army without spilling a drop of Roman blood. In 84 BC, an uprising erupted in Illyria. The consul Cinna personally led an army to crush it, but after forcing his men to march through brutal blizzards, the freezing, exhausted troops mutinied. Cinna was murdered by his own soldiers in the chaos. When Sulla learned that the Marian faction in Rome had lost its strongman, he knew it was time to strike. The following spring, Sulla sailed his veteran legions across the sea and landed at Tarentum. The remnants of the Roman government sent armies to stop him, but they were repeatedly shattered by Sulla's hardened elites. Sulla's momentum accelerated when a new generation of brilliant young commanders, including Crassus and Pompey, arrived at his camp, bringing their own private armies to join his cause. By late 82 BC, the Second Roman Civil War ended in horrific bloodshed, costing over 100,000 lives. Sulla conquered Rome for the second time. After reclaiming the capital, Sulla unleashed a terrifying, systematic purge of the state. He introduced the infamous proscriptions, public hit lists. Anyone whose name appeared on the list was stripped of all legal protection. Any citizen could legally murder them and claim a portion of their estate. The purge decimated the Roman elite. Over 80 senators and 2,600 wealthy equestrians were slaughtered. Sulla then forced the Senate to appoint him dictator for life, seizing absolute control over the Republic. After liquidating his political enemies, Sulla launched a comprehensive overhaul of the state, using unlimited power to drag Rome back to his idealized, traditional aristocratic roots. His first move was to massively expand the Senate and restore its supreme authority. Years of partisan warfare and bloody purges had emptied the Senate House. To rebuild the core of the government, Sulla doubled its size from 300 to 600 members, filling the vacancies with his most loyal officers and equestrian supporters. He then passed legislation legally stripping the citizen assemblies of their independent power, mandating that all new laws required Senate approval, and handed the ultimate judicial power back to the senators. His next target was the office of the tribune. Since the days of the Gracchi brothers, the tribunes had been the ultimate weapon for the plebeians to challenge the patricians, often sparking massive social unrest. To permanently neutralize this threat, Sulla passed strict laws. Tribunes could no longer introduce legislation directly to the assembly, and they were stripped of all judicial authority. But his most fatal blow was a career restriction. Sulla decreed that any man who served as tribune was permanently disqualified from holding any other high-ranking political office. This single law instantly destroyed the political appeal of the office, turning it into a dead-end job for ambitious elites. Finally, he locked down the political ladder. To prevent the rise of another Marius, a man who ignored the rules to hold consecutive consulships, Sulla established hard legal requirements for every government office. He mandated minimum age limits and a strict sequence of progression. An aedile had to be 30, a praetor 39, and a consul, the highest office in the Republic, had to be at least 42 years old. Sulla's overhaul also codified citizenship rights, finalized land grants for his veterans, and strictly separated military command from civilian government, making it illegal for a general to retain military command within Italy proper. Facing a fractured republic, Sulla attempted to use brutal dictatorship to repair the ancient aristocratic constitution. In this sense, he was the savior of the old order, but he failed to realize that he had actually paved a bloody highway straight toward empire. By marching an army into the capital, slaughtering his political rivals, and claiming an indefinite dictatorship, Sulla had completely destroyed the foundational constitutional principles of the Republic. He proved to future generals and ambitious politicians that power could be seized entirely by the sword. Legally and morally, he was the Republic's ultimate destroyer. Yet the man who twice marched on Rome and seized terrifying power made a decision that shocked the ancient world. After fully executing his constitutional reforms, in 80 BC, the 58-year-old dictator suddenly resigned. He handed back his power and retired to his country estate. Sulla abandoned politics, spending his final years drinking and enjoying the company of actors and musicians. In 78 BC, he died of an illness at the age of 60. Rome threw a massive, unprecedented state funeral for the terrifying warlord. Carved into his tombstone was an epitaph that Sulla had written himself, a perfect, chilling summary of his brutal life. No friend ever served me, and no enemy ever wronged me whom I have not repaid in full. The age of warlords, the fall of Sulla's constitution, and the rise of Pompey. In 80 BC, without any warning, the 58-year-old dictator Sulla stood before the citizen assembly and resigned. He stripped himself of his dictatorial power and stepped down from the rostra as a private citizen. Whispers immediately rippled through the crowd. Sulla simply looked up. His cold, piercing stare swept across the forum, and the crowd instantly fell dead silent. That silence sent a very clear message. As long as he was breathing, the oligarchic constitution he had built in blood was going nowhere. But Sulla was not immortal. In 78 BC, the ruthless dictator died. In his final days, his greatest anxiety was likely whether his political overhaul would survive him. But looking at the men he left behind, hardened, loyal lieutenants like Lucullus, Crassus, and the young prodigy Pompey, Sulla probably thought his legacy was safe. He was completely wrong. The very men he trusted to protect his system would be the exact ones to tear it apart. The power vacuum left by Sulla drew the sharks. His three primary enforcers held the real power: Lucullus commanding the east, Crassus hoarding unimaginable wealth in Rome, and the young general Sulla had nicknamed the Great Pompey. Meanwhile, the surviving opposition saw an opening. The Marian general Sertorius was carving out an independent state in Spain. The ambitious Roman consul Lepidus was plotting a rebellion in the capital. And quietly hiding in the shadows, watching the chaos unfold, was a young, calculating aristocrat named Julius Caesar. The moment Sulla died, the consul Lepidus made his move. He introduced 4 radical laws designed to dismantle Sulla's constitution, focusing specifically on restoring the power of the tribunes. When the Senate blocked him, Lepidus resorted to violence. After all, Sulla had already proven that political gridlock could be solved by marching an army on Rome. But Sulla's loyalists reacted instantly. So, a 29-year-old stepped forward: Pompey. Pompey had the talent, but handing him supreme command meant the Senate would have to publicly shatter Sulla's laws. While the Senate hesitated, a geopolitical crisis forced their hand. In the east, King Mithridates VI offered to form an alliance with Sertorius to crush Rome from both sides. Sertorius flatly refused, maintaining that he was a Roman citizen fighting Sulla's illegal dictatorship, not fighting the Republic itself. But the threat of a two-front war terrified the Senate. They caved, granted the 29-year-old Pompey unchecked command, and shipped him to Spain. In 75 BC, Pompey linked up with Metellus, but the grinding war dragged on. It wasn't until 72 BC, when Sertorius was assassinated by his own officers, that the brutal Spanish campaign finally came to an end. But just a year before the Spanish War ended, an entirely different crisis violently erupted in the heart of Italy: the Spartacus Rebellion. In 73 BC, a gladiator named Spartacus broke out of a training camp in Capua with roughly 70 heavily armed slaves. They fled to Mount Vesuvius, recruiting escaped slaves along the way. Rome initially treated them as a minor police problem, dispatching a militia of 3,000 men. Spartacus effortlessly annihilated them. When news of the victory spread, desperate slaves and bankrupt peasants flocked to his banner. Rome escalated, sending 2 full legions. Spartacus crushed them both. By the following spring, the rebel army had exploded to a terrifying 70,000 men. But this massive expansion fractured their leadership. Spartacus wanted to march north, cross the Alps, and allow the slaves to return to their homelands. His deputy, Crixus, wanted to march south and conquer the wealthy island of Sicily. The army split. Crixus took 30,000 men south and was quickly massacred by Roman legions at Mount Gargano. The Romans immediately pushed north to trap Spartacus, but the gladiator executed a brilliant tactical reversal, shattering the Roman pursuit and routing the governor of Cisalpine Gaul. The road to the Alps was completely open. Spartacus and his men were steps away from freedom. But for reasons lost to history, Spartacus suddenly turned his massive army around and marched back south toward Sicily. Facing an existential threat in their own backyard, the Roman Senate appointed Crassus to crush the rebellion. But in their very first engagement, Spartacus routed the Roman vanguard. To restore strict discipline, Crassus resorted to an ancient, horrific military punishment: decimation. 1 in every 10 men in the cowardly units was beaten to death by his own comrades. The sheer brutality worked, and the legions fell into line. At the Battle of the Salarius River, Crassus threw the full weight of his army at the rebels. Spartacus fought to the death, and the rebel army was annihilated. 36,000 slaves were killed, and another 6,000 were captured. To send an unforgettable message to anyone thinking of rebelling against Rome, Crassus had all 6,000 prisoners crucified. The crosses lined the Appian Way, stretching all the way from Capua to the gates of Rome. The slave war was over. 2 months later, Pompey returned from Spain. With Lucullus securing the eastern frontier against Pontus, the Senate believed the Republic had finally earned a moment of peace. They were completely wrong. A massive political crisis had already arrived. By Roman law, a returning general was strictly forbidden from crossing the Rubicon River with his army. The veteran commander Metellus followed the law and disbanded his troops. Pompey ignored it. He marched his veteran legions across the Rubicon and camped them directly outside the walls of Rome. With an army pointing its swords at the capital, Pompey issued 3 demands to the Senate: land for his veterans, a formal triumph, and the consulship for the following year. That third demand directly violated Sulla's constitution. Pompey was far too young to be legally elected consul. The Senate panicked. This was a military extortion, a carbon copy of Sulla's march on Rome. Terrified, the senators turned to Crassus. Crassus was camped in southern Italy, commanding 8 fully intact legions, but the Senate severely misread the situation. When Crassus saw Pompey extorting the government for the highest office in the state, he realized the tactic worked. Crassus wanted that power just as much. So he marched his own 8 legions north and camped them outside Rome. The capital was now trapped in a military vice grip between 2 massive armies. Crassus was the single richest man in the Republic, hoarding unimaginable wealth and real estate. He believed his money entitled him to supreme political power. Pompey had the military prestige. The 2 rivals realized they didn't need to fight, they just needed to share. They formed a massive political alliance. Pompey used his popularity with the troops to secure votes for Crassus, and Crassus used his bottomless wealth to buy the rest. Backed by the implicit threat of military force and massive bribery, both men were elected consuls for the year 70 BC. To secure the loyalty of the Roman public, these 2 former lieutenants took an axe to Sulla's constitution. They passed laws fully restoring the power of the tribunes and the legislative authority of the citizen assembly. They also overhauled the judicial system. Sulla had stacked the juries exclusively with patrician senators. Pompey and Crassus diluted that power, splitting the jury seats evenly between senators, equestrians, and plebeians. This specific reform instantly restored public faith in the courts and paved the way for a young plebeian lawyer named Cicero. Under the old rigged system, prosecuting a corrupt patrician governor was impossible. But under the new jury, Cicero used his brilliant oratory skills to successfully prosecute the corrupt governor of Sicily, stripping him of his wealth and forcing him into exile. The case made Cicero a political superstar. Just 8 years after Sulla died, the constitution he had built with blood and dictatorship was completely dismantled. The age limits were broken, the tribunes were restored, and the assembly had its power back. Sulla had used military force to change Rome, and now Pompey and Crassus used military force to change it right back. After his consulship ended, Pompey refused the standard deployment to govern a quiet province. The borders were stable except in the east, where Lucullus was still fighting Mithridates. Pompey was ambitious. He refused to waste his prime years managing a peaceful territory. He needed a war. The Mediterranean piracy crisis gave him the perfect excuse. For years, pirates secretly funded by Mithridates had terrorized Roman shipping lanes. The crisis had escalated to the point where grain shipments from Sicily couldn't reach Italy, and the city of Rome was facing mass starvation. In 67 BC, the tribune Gabinius proposed a radical piece of legislation. He demanded Pompey be appointed supreme commander of the Mediterranean for 3 years, granting him total authority over 20 legions, 500 warships, and a staggering budget of 140 million sesterces just to hunt down the pirates. The Senate was horrified. Pompey already had a history of extorting the government with his army, and this budget was equivalent to the entire annual revenue of the Republic. With the exception of a few politicians like Cicero and Caesar, the Senate vehemently opposed it. But the Roman citizens were starving. Driven by the threat of famine, the public assembly forced the bill through. Handed total operational control, Pompey executed a masterpiece of logistics. He divided the Mediterranean into 13 distinct military sectors, assigning a trusted commander to lock down each zone. He launched a lightning strike across the western Mediterranean, systematically destroying every pirate stronghold on land and at sea. He cleared the entire western theater in just 40 days. The surviving pirates fled east. Pompey immediately closed the net in the eastern Mediterranean, wiping out their remaining bases in 49 days. A massive military campaign that was scheduled to take 3 years was finished in exactly 89 days. Pompey killed 10,000 pirates, captured 20,000 more, and completely secured the sea. After crushing the pirates, Pompey was supposed to lay down his command and return home. He didn't. Bypassing the Senate again, he used the citizen assembly to strip Lucullus of his command in Asia Minor, taking unchecked control of the war against the kingdom of Pontus. In 66 BC, Pompey took the reins. He started with a brutal diplomatic maneuver, sending envoys to the Parthian Empire in the east to propose a military alliance. He wanted to trap Pontus and its ally Armenia in a massive strategic pincer. For Parthia, the recent expansion of Armenia was already a severe threat. Having a shared enemy, Parthia eagerly agreed to the alliance, and the two empires drew a hard border at the Euphrates River. When the king of Armenia heard about the Roman-Parthian alliance, he panicked. Caught between the terrifying military juggernauts of Rome in the west and Parthia in the east, Armenia immediately abandoned Pontus and allied with Rome, even placing a bounty on the head of Mithridates. Stripped of his last ally, Mithridates was completely isolated. He fought Pompey and was utterly crushed. The 66-year-old king fled north to the Black Sea, and the Pontic Empire collapsed. Shortly after, Mithridates' own son orchestrated a coup, seized power, and formally surrendered to Rome. The decades-long nightmare of the Punic Wars was finally over. But Pompey didn't stop. He marched his invincible legions south, tearing through the Middle East, formally annexing Antioch, Damascus, and Jerusalem into the sprawling Roman Empire. In 61 BC, the 45-year-old Pompey returned to Rome and threw the most extravagant triumph in the history of the Republic. Standing before the cheering masses, he laid out the staggering scale of his conquests. He had pushed the borders of Rome to the shores of the Black Sea and the Red Sea. 12 million people and over 1,500 cities had been added to the empire. The Roman treasury was flooded with new wealth, and solid geopolitical treaties were locked into place with Parthia, Armenia, and Egypt. At that moment, no Roman citizen had ever held this much raw, unchecked power. Pompey commanded the undivided adoration of the military, the public, and the political class. He had finally, truly earned the name Sulla gave him, Pompey the Great. But hidden in the cheering crowd of that magnificent triumph was a 39-year-old politician quietly watching the spectacle. As Julius Caesar stared at the man who had conquered the world, he understood exactly what Pompey's career had proven. Sulla's old rules were meaningless. If a man controlled the mob and commanded the loyalty of the legions, he didn't have to serve the Republic. He could just take it.